Thank you very much. It's always incredibly nice for me to be in Cambridge. I lived here for 10 years, so it's a place I know well and feel comfortable, although I was never a member of the union and so did not spend much time in this place, although I had occasionally come in to visit. The subject of my talk today is the new book that I've written, that I've spent 10 years writing, not full-time. The way that I work is I have sort of various projects on the go at any particular moment in time. But this really started in about late 2014 when I did the first interview. And I want to say a little bit about the context and the issues that it has thrown up, because it is regrettably a more timely book than one would otherwise have imagined. You will have noticed in the subtitle the reference to the word impunity, and that is the beating heart, really, of the double story that I have told in this book. To put this book in context, it's important, perhaps, to explain I have various hats. I'm a professor at the University of London. I teach international law. I'm a barrister. I've done many cases on international crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And in 2010, as some of you will know if you have come across my book, East-West Street, I received an invitation to give a lecture on the cases that I do on crimes against humanity and genocide. One thing led to another, as it often does in life. I spent a little bit of the summer of 2010 preparing for the lecture that I would give in the Ukrainian city of Lviv, which I frankly had never heard of until I worked out that Lviv is Lvov, is Lvov, is Lemberg, is Leopolis, and I knew that my grandfather had been born in Lemberg in 1904, but had never talked about it. And so this entire project, 38 Londres Street, is really the third in a trilogy, begins very simply with my search for the house where my grandfather was born. It was really a question of identity. I wanted to know more about him, to know more about myself. I spent that summer preparing to give the lecture, doing a bit of research, and stumble across the unexpected pair of facts. The man who put the concept of crimes against humanity, criminalization of harm to individuals, into international law, who was actually a professor here at Cambridge University, Hirsch Lauterpacht, came from Lviv and had studied at the law school that had invited me to give the lecture, but none of the people who'd invited me were aware of that fact. I thought, how amazing, I'm going to turn up, as I did, and disclose to them that the origins of crimes against humanity are in this law school, in this university, in this town. Then I discovered that the man who invented the word genocide, Raphael Lemkin, had also studied at the same law school, in the same university, in the same town, although not at the same time as Lauterpacht. And I arrived in Lviv and soon got a sort of mini hero's welcome as news emerged that I was the bearer of this exceptional news that this university and this law school was the font of the modern international crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity. I wrote a book about it, East-West Street. One of the characters, the fourth character, there's my grandfather, there's Lauterpacht, there's Lemkin. The fourth character is a man called Hans Frank. Hans Frank was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer from 1928 to 1933, and later became Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland. He had a deputy called Otto Wächter, and Otto Wächter is the subject of the second book, along with his rather unfortunate wife Charlotte, who was his sort of companion in arms and mass killing. And the rat line is the story of the life of an Austrian SS couple. In writing the rat line, I was given access by Otto and Charlotte's son Horst. As some of you who've read the rat line or listened to the podcast will know, to a massive private family archive. 10,000 letters, postcards, articles, extraordinary. Lisa Jardine, the late historian, said this was the material of the kind that you really understand what makes people tick, why they do what they do. And it's infused throughout my book, the rat line. Amongst the 10,000 pages, and so here we get to the breaking story, which none of you will know because the book isn't out yet. It's not published until Thursday in many languages. I'm off to Chile tomorrow to deal with the Spanish launch in Santiago, Valparaiso, and Punta Arenas. So in going through the 10,000 pages, one of the documents I came across was a 3-page typewritten letter, single space, sent to Otto Wächter from Damascus, Syria, telling Herr Wächter, Governor Wächter, don't come to Syria, it's not a good place for us Germans, head for South America. Those of you who've read The Rat Line will know that Wächter never made it to South America and died in mysterious circumstances in a Vatican-run hospital in Rome. The writer of the letter was named Walther Rauff. Walther Rauff is a name that was not familiar to me, although I subsequently learned that I had come across the name before because in my very first year at Cambridge University in 1979, I read a marvelous book that was very cultish then called In Patagonia by Bruce Chatwin. Chapter 96 of In Patagonia concerns itself with Walther Rauff. There is a man in Punta Arenas, Hum's German leader. Some of you may remember it. If you've got a copy, go and find chapter 96. It's an extraordinarily powerful written piece. In fact, in her review of it in the London Review of Books, Sybil Bedford, who's a wonderful writer, focused on that passage on Walther Rauff. I would have read it in 79-80 when I was here as a student, but I'd completely forgotten. We're in 2014, I Google, I find that Walther Rauff was a German SS officer. He had worked in the office of Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, and in 1941 he was charged with designing and then operating the system of mobile gas vans that predated the mass extermination camps. Little vans which would go around Nazi-occupied Europe, gassing groups of Jews and Poles and other opponents or objectionable individuals and groups from the regime's point of view in groups of about 50. And probably about 1 million people died in the gas vans. Rauff then goes to Tunisia to exterminate the Jews, and then to Rome, to Milan, where he becomes the head of the Gestapo. He is today a hated figure still in Milan because he was charged not only with dealing with Jews, but with partisans, communists, and opponents of Nazism in German-occupied Italy. He's caught, he escapes, he makes his way to Damascus, and after he's written the letter, I learn, he follows his own advice and goes to South America. He fetches up in a small country called Ecuador, in its capital called Quito, and in Quito, he becomes a motor mechanic for the local Mercedes-Benz concession. There's a certain irony there, given what he had done just a few years earlier. They intend, Walther and his wife Edith and the 2 sons, to stay in Ecuador. They like it. But in 1955, they meet a charming Chilean couple who say to them, you know, honestly, you're in the wrong country. You really should be in Chile. There's a big German community, and we like people like you. In 1958, they follow the advice. The couple help them to move to Chile, and they end up living in the southernmost town in the whole world, Punta Arenas, where Bruce Chatwin visited in 1975. Walther Rauff becomes the manager of a king crab cannery, catching king crabs, extracting the meat, packing the meat into small tins, and sending it off around South America and Europe as a lucrative export. In 1962, he is arrested on a warrant for his extradition from West Germany for crimes against humanity and genocide, direct connection with East-West Street. The Supreme Court of Chile in April 1963 rules that he cannot be extradited to West Germany because Chile has a 15-year statute of limitations. What that means is if the crimes have occurred more than 15 years earlier, the court can't exercise jurisdiction. The crimes occurred in 41 and 42, it's 63, can't be extradited. He goes back to Punta Arenas and resumes his life as the manager of the Pesquera Camello, the king crab cannery. Actually, just out of interest, is there anyone here from Chile or with Chilean roots? Okay, so a number of people will understand that in Chile, Rauff is generally a name that is sort of known in certain sectors of the community. And Rauff becomes a sort of scion of the community, even though everyone knows, because of his arrest in 62, and it's on the front page of all newspapers, what he has done. And life prospers. He loses his wife, Edith, and finds a new lady, Nena, with whom he makes a new life, but stays in Punta Arenas. And then, on September 11th, 1973, there is a coup d'etat in Chile, and Salvador Allende, the elected president, is overthrown, dies, probably by his own hand, and is replaced by a four-man military junta. And Rauff is not only thrilled because he supports the move, but personally delighted, because the head of the four-man military junta is his friend from Quito, Ecuador. His name is Augusto Pinochet. It is Pinochet who brought Rauff to Chile. You couldn't invent it. This is not, until the book comes out, generally known. Now, the moment that I discover all of this, another part of my sort of hardwired brain cuts into action. Pinochet. That's a name I know. It's a name that I've been touched by, because on the 30th of October 1998, while I was in Paris, visiting a grave in relation to the death of my grandfather, I received a phone call from my barrister's chambers in London. Would I be willing to act for Mr. Pinochet, who had been arrested 2 weeks earlier on a warrant issued by a Spanish judge, Balthazar Garzón, alleging crimes against humanity, torture, disappearances, and genocide? I said to Paul, my clerk in chambers, well, I'm occupied tending to my family issues. I'll speak to you tomorrow. I arrive at the Cimetière Pantin in Paris, meet my wife, and say to her, and I'll be very honest about it, with some excitement, because the Pinochet case was the biggest international criminal law case since Nuremberg. It had never happened in the history of humankind that a former head of state in one country is arrested in another country on allegations of international crimes, raising the question of whether General Pinochet is entitled to claim immunity for the jurisdiction of the courts for acts committed while he was president. Now, lest you think this is a highly theoretical issue, it is not. Let me remind you of the judgment of the Supreme Court of last July in relation to the case of Trump versus the United States, when the United States Supreme Court ruled that a former American president has a presumption of immunity in relation to all and any official acts. It's exactly the same issue as arose in the Pinochet case. So I explained to my wife with some excitement, and she says to me, "Will you do it?" And I say, "Well, you know about the cab rank principle." For those of you who are not barristers, which is probably almost all of you, the cab rank principle is one of our ethical rules that we take very seriously and that I'm a passionate believer in, which is that you're like a taxi driver as a barrister. You're driving along, someone puts their hand up, wants a fare. You can't say, "I don't like the cut of their jib. I don't like their gender. I don't like the way they look. I don't like the colour of their skin." We have an obligation to act for everybody, all and sundry. There are exceptions. And so I say to Natalia, my wife, "Well, cab rank principle." She says, I know all about the cab rank principle. She is an American lawyer, and she thinks the cab rank principle is a complete nonsense. And we have long had disagreements about the cab rank principle. I'm a believer, she's not. And I said, "Cab rank principle." She says, "Well, I know all about the cab rank principle, but are you going to do it?" And I say, "Cab rank principle, cab rank principle." And she says, "Well, look, you can do it if you want to do it, but if you do it, I will divorce you tomorrow." We are 27 years on, very happily married. And I turned it down. I was able to take advantage of an exception to the cab rank principle, which is a rule on professional embarrassment. I would be professionally embarrassed if I took the case. Why? Because 5 days before I get the phone call in Paris, I had done a radio program with the BBC World Service with Zainab Badawi, and she had pushed me as an academic on the key and central question: does General Pinochet have a right to claim immunity from the jurisdiction of the English courts? And I said, "We don't know. It's never happened before. We're in completely uncharted waters. We have no idea." But Zainab Badawi pushed me, and eventually I said, "Look, from my personal perspective, for a serving head of state, I can see the rationale of the rule. You can't be going around arresting presidents and prime ministers while they're in power. But for a former president or prime minister, I don't see that the rationale exists." And that answer allowed me to get out of the Pinochet case. 3 or 4 days later, I was retained by Human Rights Watch, and I acted against General Pinochet. My wife did not object to that. So I was then involved in the Pinochet case for the entire period of his incarceration, 503 days, until he returned to Chile on the 3rd of March 2000, when Jack Straw, the then Home Secretary, determined that General Pinochet was unfit to stand trial. And I'd written a little bit about the Pinochet case, more academic types of books, but I'd never really got involved in the whole story. So, in a sense, when I saw the letter from Walther Rauff and discovered that he'd ended up in Chile, the way my brain works, I thought, could it be there's a connection between Pinochet and Rauff? And in particular, could it be that Rauff was involved in some of the crimes that landed on my desk between 1998 and 2000? There would be a most interesting connection there, because it would effectively mean that the story I tell in East West Street on the origins of crimes against humanity and genocide trickles through into a direct connection with my own life. Many of you here will know what I say in family life, or if you're a journalist, or if you're a lawyer, or a barrister, or a scientist. Sometimes we have hunches. Those hunches may be wrong, but I've learnt to trust my hunches. There was something there. And so I decided, when I saw this letter, that I would begin to explore. I began, the very first interview that I did was in 2015, with Balthazar Garzón, who was the judge who had sent to London on the afternoon of the 16th of October 1998 a request for the arrest of Augusto Pinochet in his hospital bed in a London clinic on Devonshire Place in room 801. And so I have got to the heart of the exact circumstances in which that happened. I have interviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of people. And the two issues that are at the heart of this book, on the basis of the hunch that I had, are the following. One, was Augusto Pinochet really infirm, or was there a deal between the British and the Chileans to send him back to Chile, avoid sending him to Madrid, and get rid of the problem? Many of us had an instinct that something had happened. Just from the nodding around the room, something had happened, but nothing had ever come out. And the second question, of course, was, did Pinochet retain the assistance of Walther Rauff? And the book provides compelling, clear, and unambiguous answers to both of those questions. My wonderful former editor in New York, Vicky Wilson, had explained to me, she said, it's really important in telling these stories, Philippe, to explain to the reader who is intelligent not only what you have discovered, but how you've gone about finding it. So I'm going to share a little bit of that with you, and then we can open it up to questions and to discussion. So you start in 2014, 2015. One of the things that you need to understand, the Chileans in the room will know, is that following a particularly heinous act of killing outside the territory of the United States, outside the territory of Chile, in the United States in September 1976, the assassination of Orlando Letelier, who had been Allende's Minister of Defense, the DINA, the intelligence service of General Pinochet, run by a man called Manuel Contreras, was shut down. And Contreras ordered all of the documents that concerned the operations of the DINA to be destroyed. So there are no documents in relation to any of the crimes perpetrated in that period. Reliance is exclusively on witness testimony. And that means you can't just do desktop research or go to the archives. You have to find people, you have to persuade them to talk to you, you have to build up trust, and it means you go back repeatedly to the same country. Some of the people were in Germany, some of the people were in the United Kingdom. Second thing you need to understand by way of context is that General Pinochet gave himself complete immunity from the jurisdiction of the Chilean courts in 1977 with an amnesty law. And then when he finally left office in 1990, he installed himself as a senator for life, which gave him an additional immunity. So when he arrives in London 8 years later, in October 1998, to visit Mrs. Thatcher and so on and so forth, and buy books at Hatchard's, he loved books about Napoleon, and to buy videos, he loved Star Wars movies. He believed himself to have a complete protection in a country that loved him, because he'd helped in the Falklands-Malvinas War. It plays a very significant role. That's the context in which I embark with my pitiful Spanish, assisted by an absolutely brilliant Chilean PhD student at UCL, Montserrat Madariaga, who has been extraordinary over the last 5 or 6 years as we've worked together on this, to uncover. And it means you talk to lots and lots of people. And the people are indeed extraordinary. To give you an example, the interpreter, possibly my favorite character out of many remarkable characters in the book, Jean Pateras. I track her down. Why? She was the interpreter for Scotland Yard throughout Pinochet's incarceration because he couldn't speak English. So for every stage of the procedure, from the moment of his arrest until the moment he left, Jean Pateras was present. Those are the kinds of eyes and ears you want to speak to get a sense of what was going on. And I found Jean. She agreed to talk to me. She's a wonderful person, highly intelligent, highly articulate, fascinating, with a big heart and a very decent sense of the world. She told me about the moment they arrested Augusto Pinochet. She gets a call. Scotland Yard. Jean, we need you. We've got an arrest, bloke who doesn't speak any English at all. Who is it, she says. Sorry, can't tell you, top secret, you'll be interested. She's half Chilean. So she goes off to Scotland Yard with 4 officers from the extradition squad. They descend on the London Clinic on Devonshire Place. They enter the building. They take the lift up to the 8th floor. And outside room 801 are 2 Chilean private security guards who will not let them into the room. We will arrest you, she is told to tell them, unless you let us into the room. They are allowed into the room. Jean enters first. She observes General Pinochet in bed. He's been awoken to give him a little time to get himself ready, in his pajamas, lying in bed, late at night on a Friday, and she reads him his rights in the normal way and says, I am informing you that you are under arrest for the crime of murder on the basis of an arrest warrant alleging you have been engaged in genocide and crimes against humanity and torture and disappearances. And I'm, of course, in the presence of Jean, like, whoa, 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 whoa. I want to know every detail about what follows. How did he react? How did he react, she says? This is how he reacted. He looked at me and he said, I know the fucker who's behind this. It's Juan Garces in Madrid. Now, he got it exactly right. He did know exactly who was behind it. Juan Garces is a Spanish lawyer who in 1973 on September the 11th was in the Moneda Palace with Salvador Allende. Allende tells him to leave and instructs him or asks him not to forget what has happened and tell the world the story. And Allende's instruction is followed through by Juan Garces. 23 years pass, and Juan Garces comes to know a group of Chilean refugees who are keen to find ways on the basis of universal jurisdiction to do to Augusto Pinochet what is beginning to be done in other countries in relation to the senior members of the Argentine military dictatorship. That is to say, proceedings against them in foreign lands. Juan Garces gathers the evidence and introduces 4 Chilean refugees to a public prosecutor named Carlos Castrosana. It's not Balthazar Garzon who started the case, it's Carlos Castrosana. I know this because when my book, The Rat Line, came out in February 2021, I did an interview in El País newspaper, and about 3 months later, my editor at Anagrama in Barcelona got in touch and said, there is a public prosecutor who has got in touch with me who would like to contact you and tell you how the Pinochet case really started, which we didn't know. As far as we were concerned, it was Garzón in 1998. Sure, it was COVID, we couldn't meet, we Zoomed in May 2021, so 23 years after all of these proceedings, a long time has passed. And we do a 3-hour Zoom, and he tells me what happens. Public prosecutor gets a visit from 4 Chileans. Can you find a way under Spanish law to go against Augusto Pinochet? He goes away, he researches it. He concludes that the answer is yes, there is a legal basis because, curiously, General Franco has introduced into Spanish law crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity with universal jurisdiction. Quite why Franco did that, we do not know, but he did. And unwittingly, he took a much broader definition of genocide and crimes against humanity than in international law, which lowered the bar and made it much easier to bring a case. Castrosana meets again with the Chileans and says, yes, there is a way forward. But, he says, you need to be aware that the Chilean courts are, the Spanish courts are very conservative. And it would be much better if you went and found a group of Spanish victims, because I think with Spanish victims, I can persuade the judges to open the case. So they go away, the Chileans, and they come back with 4 Spanish names. And he settles on one person. The one person is a man called Carmelo Soria. And Carmelo Soria was the head of the UN office in Santiago, who on the 14th of July 1976 was abducted and disappeared. His body was found 3 days later in a canal. The authorities said he was drunk, he was having an affair, he had a motor accident. None of that's true. He was murdered because of his political views. He was on the left, and he was harboring people and informing people who were under threat. Castrosana says, that's the one. He's well known in Spain. There was a big issue when he was killed in Spain, and he is a well-known and reputable figure. His brother Arturo was the publisher of Pablo Neruda, and his grandfather Arturo was a very well-known urban designer who has an area and a street of Madrid named after him. We'll go with Carmelo Soria. And the case is filed. And it takes off. And eventually the case reaches Balthazar Garzón in October 1998, whilst Pinochet is in London. That's another story, which I describe in detail in the book. We don't have time to get into now. I thank Carlos Castrosana on our first Zoom meeting. We spent a lot of time together subsequently. And we end the conversation. I'm actually with my wife in Totnes. Now, one bit of the story that I haven't told you, everything is connected, is that my wife's mother, Maria Elena de la Iglesia, is a refugee from the Spanish Civil War. In 1940, aged 5, she and her mother and father were taken in by the Elmhursts in Dartington and given refuge in Dartington. And my mother-in-law is Spanish. And I told her the story, as I've told you the story. She's in her 80s now, so her hearing is good, but not 100% perfect. And she said, what was the name again of the Spanish gentleman, the UN man, whose case started the whole Pinochet case? I said, Carmelo Soria. She looks at me and she says, of course. Now I remember. Cousin Carmelo. And so the curiosity for me was that having started on this entire project with my grandfather's story, it now turns out that the Pinochet story was intimately connected to my wife's family. Immediately she contacts the family in Chile. 2 weeks later, I'm in Santiago, not just interviewing and talking with strangers, but through marriage, family members. And all of you know, when you're talking with family members, it's completely different. You get a lot more information, people trust you, people know you're going to look carefully after the stories. That was the kind of curious coincidence that permitted me to write the book that I have written. And the coincidences just go on and on and on. I'd mentioned that when Jean Pateras reached the room in the London clinic, they were armed with an arrest warrant. The arrest warrant was signed by the duty magistrate on the evening of the 16th of October 1998. Who's the duty magistrate? Nicholas Evans. Who's Nicholas Evans? He's my next door neighbour. Okay? I mean, you really couldn't invent it. Actually, our gardens abut like this, and he's a wonderful person. A few years ago, he planted a whole lot of bamboo, which has gone mad and caused us a lot of mayhem, but it's all being dealt with beautifully. He's never given an interview to anyone, except, as with family, your neighbour, somehow the relationship is different. You can tell the story. We sit down. Actually, it was in 2016, many, many years ago now. And he told me the story of what happened when Scotland Yard turned up at his house. And he says to me, they came, it was about 8 o'clock. They called me, they warned me, I didn't know the name Pinochet. He said, I'm not like you, I don't do international stuff. I vaguely heard the name, but didn't really mean anything. They turn up, they've got a draft arrest warrant, and the arrest warrant is for genocide and torture and other crimes against humanity. He said, look, Philippe, I don't do international law as a magistrate. I deal with the regular stuff. Genocide, torture, these were words that I'd never encountered. So I crossed out those words and I wrote murder. Mayhem ensues, as some of you who are lawyers will understand, because the English courts do not have jurisdiction over the crime of murder committed in Chile. They only have jurisdiction over international crimes, and murder is not an international crime. That causes a few days of mayhem in London, again described in full in the book. Anyway, the point that I make is it's complex, but it's interesting, and it's peppered with these curious coincidences. We fast forward, and the big issue, of course, on Pinochet is, did he go home on a concocted decision about his health? And that I have now been able to prove absolutely conclusively, having met the chief Chilean negotiator in the whole Pinochet episode, a wonderful person named Christian Tolosa, who was the chief speechwriter for President Frey of Chile, and who was invited to be the chief interlocutor with the British because he was trained as a psychologist and he had done his PhD at Exeter University. And he was thought to understand how the British mind works. And this was the principal basis for retaining his services. And he creates a strategy for getting Pinochet back, even though he is not a fan of Pinochet. And so finds himself in a difficult situation with a, opposition between his personal views, which is send Pinochet to Madrid, and his professional activities as a civil servant, asked by the government to bring this guy home so that we can try him. And he is the one who basically negotiates the deal with the chief of staff at 10 Downing Street, Jonathan Powell, whose name you'll be familiar with, a remarkable individual also, the one who really is the architect of the Good Friday Agreement, and someone for whom I have enormous respect and admiration, and whom I have interviewed for the book, and who has confirmed in full the whole story. There was a deal. The deal is revealed in the book. they will determine he is unfit for trial. In return, Chile will take him home, and when he gets home, he will be stripped of his immunity. That is the deal. And now we get to the point of maximum sensitivity, the reason I'm going to Chile on Wednesday. I mentioned earlier that all of the documents in relation to Pinochet and the crimes of that era have been destroyed. In not a single case in Chile, I am told, does a document exist or been relied upon in the Chilean courts connecting Pinochet personally to an act of mass murder. And the British said, we want proof that you can connect Pinochet to an act of mass murder so that his immunity can be stripped. The Chileans come up with a document. Tolosa brings the document to London in September 1999. The document concerns a most notorious act of mass killing that occurred very shortly after the coup d'etat, in English, the Caravan of Death, in Spanish, Caravan de la Muerte, where a group of army officers went around the country executing senior trade union and political figures who were thought to be opponents of the new regime. And the piece of paper that Christian Tolosa brings to Britain is signed by Augusto Pinochet, directly connecting him. Now, this is a major news story in Chile because no such document has ever appeared before. And it indicates that documents must exist somewhere in some archive, a secret archive. I went to visit various judges, including at the Supreme Court of Chile, including those charged with dealing with Pinochet-era crimes. They were completely unaware and frankly disbelieving that such a document exists. But Jonathan Powell said to me, yes, I was given this document, I read the document, I handed it over to the British authorities, it must be somewhere. Where it is, we don't know, maybe protected under national security, 30-year rule in terms of archives. But the upshot is, on that side of the story, I was able to find the absolute connection. In relation to Walther Rauff, I'll just leave you hanging because we don't have time to get into how I went about doing that. But the upshot of the story was, in simple terms, that over the course of 8 years, I met numerous former agents of the DINA, the intelligence service, including several who had personally been involved in acts of mass killing and had themselves killed on a large scale. The leading one of those individuals who had witnessed much as a very young man under the age of 18 will be known to some of the Chileans, a man known as El Mosito, Jorgelino Vergara, who was the junior waiter in the home of Manuel Contreras from 1973 to 1979, and who saw everyone coming in. I meet with El Mosito. I show him 4 photographs of men wearing glasses of the kind worn by Henry Kissinger. That was the kind of glasses that Walther Rauff wore in the 1970s. Amongst the 4, incidentally, was one of my childhood heroes, Eric Morecambe, because he had similar glasses. And I showed the photos to El Mosito. At no point did we mention any name. And he said, no, don't know this one. No, don't know this one. No, don't know this one. This one I know. We start talking about this one he knows. And with that, a door opens. I come to learn what El Mosito was aware of what the man I knew to be Walther Rauff had done. He worked for another fishery not in Punta Arenas, but in the port of San Antonio, the Pesquera Arauco. The Pesquera Arauco was acquired by Augusto Pinochet and Manuel Contreras on September the 11th, 1973. Why? Because the Pesquera Arauco had a fleet of 310 refrigerated Chevrolet C10 vans. And I leave it to you to use your imagination as to what those vans were used for. One of the people I met who was a detainee at 38 Londres Street, which was the principal torture center right in the heart of Santiago, a man called Leon Gomez, told me that he was transported in a Pesquera Arauco refrigerated van. He was taken to 38 Londres Street, and at 38 Londres Street, he was personally interrogated and tortured by Walther Rauff. And with those witness testimonies, I was able to begin to prise open the story, which ultimately leads to a situation of double impunity. A situation in which Pinochet returns, is stripped of his immunity, is indicted, does not then face trial for a limited period because of his health issues, apparently, and then there is a determination by the Chilean courts he is fit to stand trial. He is indicted in a mass of cases, but he dies before the proceedings open in court, under house arrest, a broken individual. So it's not total impunity, but it is partial, significant impunity. In relation to Rauff, he never faces his day in court. And I open the book with a quote, lest one thinks that the issue of impunity is a modern feature of our legal order, with a quote from 1577, a French jurist and philosopher, Jean Bodin. There is not anything that hath bred greater troubles than the liberty which is given to the wicked to off-end with all impunity. And that really is a quotation that I think is extremely relevant for our times, at a time when we have a president in the United States who is a convicted felon, where we have two serving heads of state or government, Mr. Putin and Mr. Netanyahu, indicted for international crimes by the International Criminal Court, in which just yesterday the issue arose of whether another political leader, Marine Le Pen, should or should not be able to stand for high political office in France. Writing this book, it never occurred to me when I started in 2014 that we lived in such an age of impunity. But I have come to understand in the last few days that the interest in the book is not just a historic one in relation to Pinochet in the 70s or Rauff in the 40s, but a much bigger set of issues concerned with the question of how societies deal with terrible wrongs that have happened and the consequences of doing nothing. Let me stop there and let's put it open to questions and conversation. Thank you. Was there someone over there? Yeah, there's someone over here. It's always just once you get the first question, the others just flow through. Thank you for asking the first question.
Thank you, Philippe. That was a wonderful disposition. What would have happened if you hadn't had that somewhat convenient conversation with Zawahiri?
I would have done it. I would have done the case, and I think my life would have been completely different, because I do believe in the crab rank principle. It only applies, incidentally, in relation to domestic proceedings. So at the international level, you are not bound to act for everyone who comes to you. But I would have done it, and the fact of having acted for Augusto Pinochet would have been something I would have been associated with subsequently, and I've got no doubt there would have been consequences for that in terms of the direction that my career has taken. You will be forever remembered as one of Augusto Pinochet's lawyers. Now, I have acted for some pretty bad people on some pretty bad issues, and that's just the price that you pay. And I found myself in a conflictual situation between my professional ethics and my love for my wife, and I found a way out, but left to my own devices. If she had said nothing, I would have done it, and I suspect my entire career would have taken a different path. I sort of know that in a real sense, because when I turned down the brief, the person who accepted it was my best friend in the world, James Cameron, who features as a major character in the book, and who is still my best friend. Today we survived, but it was very painful as an experience, and we agreed in the course of the proceedings that it was so painful that until the proceedings were over, we would cease all contact and communication. I mean, this is someone I speak to 2-3 times a week and have done for the last 35 years, 40 years. So it was very painful, very difficult, and he ended up leaving the bar. So would I have left the bar? I don't know, probably not, but I think my career would have taken a different course. Such is life. These are the accidents of life history. There's a lady here.
Do you think it's probable that Salvador Allende was assassinated?
I'm asked whether it was probable that Salvador Allende was assassinated. I think it's pretty clear that he committed suicide. I mean, I have spoken to people who were present in the Moneda Palace who have said to me he was preparing to commit suicide, and they believe that he did commit suicide. So I know it's not proven and established 100%, but on the basis of the accounts that I've heard from people who were in the Moneda Palace, they do not say that he was murdered by the military or by Pinochet or by the junta. He definitely died that day, and he died by gunshot wound on the sofa of his office. I've been to that office. I've seen the sofa. I think that's pretty clear. I mean, you sort of learn in life that there are always multiple interpretations, but I think it's pretty clear that that is what happened.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I just wonder, wasn't it risky trying to extradite Pinochet back to Chile rather than extraditing him? Perhaps it didn't exist then, the European Court of Human Rights.
So the initial request for the arrest of Augusto Pinochet came from Spain. It was then followed by requests from Belgium, France, and Switzerland. There was no request to extradite him to Chile, and therefore there was no way of diverting the extradition request away from Spain to Chile. The Chileans would have had their own reasons for wanting to do that. If you read the book, you'll come to understand that what they determined in the hands of the extremely impressive Christian Tolosa was that they would wait until the fuss had died down, determine when the British found themselves in an embarrassing situation, and that embarrassment came in the course of the proceedings before the House of Lords, when, following the first judgment in November 1998, where the 5 judges of the Supreme Court ruled by 3 votes to 2 that Augusto Pinochet could not claim immunity for international crimes, it then emerged that one of the 5 judges, Lord Hoffman, had a connection with Amnesty International, who had participated in the proceedings, and that had not been disclosed to the parties. So that ruling was set aside, and a new set of hearings were held. That whole incident caused a lot of embarrassment for the British government, and that was the point in March, April 99, that the Chileans decided to act to take advantage of that sense of embarrassment, and they proceeded to run the argument. The basis to get rid of him was a loophole in the extradition laws, which allowed you, perfectly reasonably, I think, not to extradite a person who's unfit for trial. Now, the unfitness for trial issue is contested, and there are people, for example, Jonathan Sumption, who was counsel for Jack Straw throughout these proceedings, who says that the medical evidence was absolutely clear and he was not fit for trial. Let's not forget that the Chilean court subsequently ruled that he was fit for trial. But what you will find in the book is evidence which I think is incontrovertible. Firstly, the forensic medical examiner of Scotland Yard, one Peter Dean, who was with Pinochet from day 3 of his arrest right up until the day he returned to Chile. When the news emerged in January 2000 of medical evidence that Pinochet was not fit to stand trial, Peter Dean intervened directly with Jack Straw, wrote to him and said, "I've dealt with this man for a year and a half. He may be frail. He is absolutely fit to stand trial. I have spent a career dealing with these issues for Scotland Yard." What happens next? He receives a phone call, does Peter Dean, the next morning from Scotland Yard, removing him from the case. More to the point, I've spoken to the people who wrote a 10-page dossier. I'm in conversation with some of these people, and they say, "Well, of course you know about the dossier, Philippe." I say, "What dossier?" "The 10-pager." "What 10-pager?" "The 10-pager in which we set out and explained to Augusto Pinochet how he could pretend he was demented." I mean, when you get that kind of evidence, and finally we started with, but let us finish with Jean Pateras, who is a marvel. She describes many things, and one of the things she describes is coming to the house in Wentworth where Pinochet was incarcerated, meeting the general, and he says to her, Jean, something extraordinary has happened. A lady came to visit me yesterday, and I didn't know who she was. And then they told me it was my wife. Jean looked at him and said, "Come on, pull the other one." And he looks at her, and there is that knowing look. She finds him practicing getting in and out of a wheelchair, pretending he's infirm. There's no question that it was concocted. He was old, it is true, but Peter Dean and everyone who examined him in Chile concluded that he was fit to stand trial, and he would have stood trial if he had not died of a heart attack in 2006. So the story is a complex one, and if you want little clues, the kind of thing that I focus on, if any of you have read or have at home the memoir of Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister at the time, go through the memoir, look at the index, and you will notice that in the index there is not a single reference to Chile or to Pinochet. Now, this was the biggest criminal case in history in more than 50 years. Mr. Blair plainly did not want to talk about the Pinochet case or what happened. And that was the kind of clue that alerted me early on to a sense that something was up. It's just your instinct. We trust our instincts. We know, we see the clues, we work out what's going on, and you just have to follow that line and get to the bottom of it. And it took 10 years, but eventually I got there. I mean, the reaction in Britain, I suspect, I mean, there's quite a lot of interest, but it's not on the same scale as in Chile or in Spain. And in Spain, of course, it's very big because Pinochet wasn't just about Pinochet. Pinochet was really about Franco. Pinochet was about the failure of Spain, which raises all sorts of questions of its entitlement to bring proceedings in relation to Pinochet, its complete failure to deal with the crimes of the Civil War and the crimes that followed once the Civil War was over. So these are really complex stories. And in fact, they explain to us that the legacy of atrocity has a long arm. And we know that, too, in our own country. Any of you who've read one of my favourite non-fiction books from recent years, the great writer Patrick Radden Keefe, Say Nothing, about Northern Ireland, and one person who has disappeared, Jean McConville. In Chile, there are 1,300 or more disappeared still. In Northern Ireland, it's just 4 or 5. But still in Northern Ireland, it's a really big issue. And in Chile, it's a huge issue. When you start disappearing people, you leave a legacy that divides a society, and saying nothing and doing nothing is not a solution. But one of the other themes of this book is that I'm very open-minded about how you act. The criminal justice system is one way, but there are other ways. There are also truth and reconciliation processes, as, for example, happened in South Africa, and did also happen in Chile, but didn't go far enough. But the other aspect that exists, that for me is very important, is literature. Literature fills the gap. When the state and the authorities and the criminal justice system do not step in, writers step in. Bruce Chatwin wrote about Rauff. That was hugely significant. The great Chilean novelist, Roberto Bolaño, wrote 2 novels in which Rauff features as a character. In Nights in Chile, Rauff is the man who is used to obtain lessons in Marxism and Gramsci for Pinochet. And then, of course, there is Pablo Neruda, who in 1965 writes a newspaper article about the Rauff case. And he says, and these words will mean more to you if and when you read the book, he decries the failure of the Chilean courts to extradite Rauff to West Germany. And then he says, it is certainly the case that this man, Rauff, knows something about vans. That was 1965. And when you learn what exactly Rauff did, you will see that the role of poets and novelists and non-fiction writers in filling the gap where society fails to step in is incredibly important in telling stories that tell us about the importance of justice. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Right, if it's